Most people believe they have a spending problem. They don't. They have an identity problem. And until they understand the difference, no budget, no app, no financial plan will ever hold. You can track every dollar, cut every expense, even double your income, and still feel like you're falling behind, still feel like something is missing, still feel the quiet pressure to spend again, to reach for something, to fix something you can't quite name. And that's where the truth begins, not in your bank account, but in the space between who you are and who you believe you should be. Because here's what no one tells you. Money is rarely about money. It is about identity. It is about perception. It is about the silent, invisible gap between your current self and the version of yourself you think the world will respect. And every time you open your wallet, you are not just making a transaction, you are making a statement. A quiet declaration of who you believe you are or who you are trying to become. You don't notice it at first. It starts small, a purchase that feels justified, a reward after a long week, a small upgrade that makes you feel like you're moving forward. And in that moment, it feels harmless, even logical. You tell yourself you deserve it, that you've earned it, that this is part of becoming better, becoming more, becoming someone who has their life together. But if you slow down, if you really look closely, you'll see something deeper, something quieter, something far more dangerous. You are not buying the thing, you are buying the feeling of being enough, the feeling of being admired, the feeling of being seen, the feeling of finally aligning with the image you carry in your head of the person you want to be. And for a brief moment, it works. The tension disappears, the doubt softens, the gap closes just enough for you to breathe, but only for a moment, because that version of yourself was never built. It was borrowed, and borrowed identities always come with interest. This is why so many people feel stuck, even as their income grows. This is why raises don't create relief, why promotions don't create stability, why more money doesn't solve the problem, because the problem was never the amount, it was the meaning attached to it. You are not trying to survive, you are trying to prove something, and proving something is an endless game because there is always someone ahead, always a higher standard, always a new version of enough that moves just out of reach the moment you get close. Look around, you'll see it everywhere. People who appear stable on the outside, but are quietly drowning inside. Lives that look complete, but feel fragile. Smiles that hide stress, success that hides pressure. And beneath all of it, a pattern repeating over and over again. Spend to feel better, spend to feel worthy, spend to feel in control. And when the feeling fades, do it again. You are not alone in this. In fact, you are participating in one of the most common behavioral loops in modern life. A loop so normalized that it feels invisible. A loop that begins with discomfort, moves into action, and ends in temporary relief only to restart again. And the longer you stay inside it, the harder it becomes to see it clearly, because it begins to feel like reality itself. But it's not reality, it's a pattern, and patterns can be broken, but only if you are willing to see them for what they are. Most people never do. They stay at the surface. They talk about budgeting, about saving, about cutting costs. They treat the symptoms and ignore the source. And for a while, that can create small improvements, a little more control, a little more awareness. But eventually, the pattern returns because the root was never touched, the identity was never questioned. And without that, nothing truly changes. Here is the uncomfortable truth. You are not building a life. You are maintaining an illusion that everything is fine, that you are on track, that you are becoming the person you want to be. And every purchase becomes a piece of that illusion, a way to reinforce it, a way to protect it, a way to avoid facing the gap that still exists beneath it. And the more you invest in the illusion, the more expensive it becomes to maintain. This is where the pressure begins. Quiet at first, almost unnoticeable, but over time, it grows. You feel it in your decisions, in your hesitation, in the subtle anxiety that appears when you check your account, in the way you justify things you once would have questioned, in the way you avoid looking too closely at the numbers, because deep down, you already know something is off. But acknowledging it would require something far more difficult than adjusting your budget. It would require adjusting your identity, and that is where most people stop. Because identity feels fixed. It feels personal. It feels like who you are. But what you don't realize is that much of your identity is constructed, built from comparison, from expectation, from what you've been taught to value. You didn't wake up one day and decide what success looks like. You absorbed it from culture, from social media, from the people around you, and once that image was formed, it began to influence everything. What you buy, how you spend, what you prioritize, what you fear. You are not just managing money, you are managing a story about who you are supposed to be. And every time your reality doesn't match that story, tension appears, discomfort, restlessness, a subtle feeling that you are behind, that you are missing something, that you are not quite where you should be. And that feeling is powerful, powerful enough to override logic, powerful enough to push you into decisions that don't make sense on paper, but feel necessary in the moment. This is why intelligent people still struggle financially, not because they lack knowledge, but because knowledge does not override identity. You can understand compound interest, asset allocation, long-term investing, and still make impulsive decisions that contradict all of it. Because in the moment, you are not acting as a rational planner, you are acting as a human being trying to resolve an emotional tension. And emotions don't follow spreadsheets. They follow meaning, they follow identity, they follow the quiet need to feel like you belong to a certain level, a certain lifestyle, a certain version of yourself. And as long as that need remains unexamined, it will continue to drive your behavior in ways you don't fully control. This is the paradox. The more you try to fix your finances without addressing your identity, the more frustrated you become, because you feel like you should be doing better. You feel like you know better. And yet, the pattern continues. And that creates a second layer of pressure, shame, self-doubt, a quiet internal narrative that says something must be wrong with you. But nothing is wrong with you. You are responding exactly as you were conditioned to respond. You were taught to associate money with worth, with status, with progress, with success. And when those associations are challenged, when your reality doesn't match the image, you instinctively try to close the gap, not through patience, not through long-term discipline, but through immediate action, immediate correction, immediate relief. And spending provides that relief faster than almost anything else. It is accessible, it is immediate, it is socially reinforced, and most importantly, it is invisible. No one sees the internal transaction that takes place. No one sees the identity you are trying to step into. All they see is the surface, the appearance, the outcome. And as long as the surface looks intact, the pattern continues. But beneath that surface, something else is happening. The gap is widening, because each time you spend to feel like someone else, you move further away from becoming that person for real. You delay the actual work, the quiet, consistent, often uncomfortable process of building a life that aligns with your values instead of your image. And over time, that delay compounds, not just financially, but psychologically. You begin to feel disconnected from your goals, from your decisions, from yourself, and that is the cost no one calculates. Because it doesn't show up in your bank account, it shows up in your sense of control, your sense of direction, your sense of clarity about who you are and where you are going. And without that clarity, money becomes reactive, emotional, unstable, not because you are careless, but because you are trying to navigate something deeper than numbers. You are trying to navigate identity. And until you face that directly, nothing else will hold. Not budgets, not strategies, not systems, because all of those operate on behavior, and behavior is downstream of identity. So if your identity remains unchanged, your behavior will eventually return to match it. That is the law most people never learn. And it is the reason so many financial plans fail, not because they are wrong, but because they are. If you want to understand why your financial behavior keeps repeating itself, you have to stop looking at your bank statements and start looking at your patterns. Not what you spend, but why you spend, not how often, but what triggers it. Because beneath every financial decision that feels irrational, there is a logic, just not a financial one. It is psychological, it is emotional, and more often than not, it is invisible to the person making the decision. This is where most people get lost. They assume that bad outcomes come from bad planning. That overspending is simply a lack of discipline, that if they just tried harder, tracked better, or restricted more, everything would fall into place. But that assumption ignores a fundamental truth. Behavior is not driven by knowledge, it is driven by identity. And identity is shaped by forces that most people never consciously examine. At the center of this is something subtle but powerful, the gap between who you are and who you believe you should be. Not the realistic version of yourself, but the imagined one, the one shaped by comparison, by exposure, by the endless stream of curated lives you see every day. That version becomes your internal standard. And once it exists, it begins to create pressure. You start measuring yourself against it, quietly at first, then more frequently, then almost constantly, and every time you feel that you fall short, a small discomfort appears, not enough to disrupt your life, but enough to influence your behavior, enough to push you towards something that might close that gap. Even temporarily, that is where spending enters the equation, not as a financial act, but as a psychological response. You are not buying because you need. You are buying because you feel misaligned, because something inside you is telling you that you are not quite there yet, not quite enough, not quite where you should be. And in that moment, the purchase becomes a bridge, a way to step closer to that imagined version of yourself. You buy the clothes that match the identity you admire. You choose the environments that reflect the lifestyle you aspire to. You upgrade not because the old version failed, but because it no longer fits the image you are trying to maintain. And each of these decisions feels justified, because they are tied to something deeper than utility. They are tied to meaning. This is what makes identity-driven spending so difficult to detect. It does not feel like a mistake. It feels like progress. It feels like alignment. It feels like you are moving forward, becoming more, stepping into a better version of yourself. And because of that, you rarely question it. You rarely pause and ask whether the direction you are moving is actually grounded in reality or simply anchored in perception. Over time, this creates a pattern, a loop that begins with comparison, moves into discomfort, transitions into spending, and ends in temporary relief. But the relief does not last, because the identity you are trying to match is not fixed. It evolves. It expands, it shifts as quickly as the environment that created it. And so the gap reappears, slightly wider each time, slightly harder to close, and so the cycle repeats. What you are experiencing is not randomness. It is not bad luck. It is not even poor decision-making in the traditional sense. It is a feedback loop between your internal identity and your external actions. And unless that loop is interrupted at the source, it will continue regardless of how much money you make, how much you save, or how many systems you try to implement. To understand this more clearly, you have to look at the layers beneath your behavior. The first layer is self-image. This is the version of yourself you believe to be true, not who you actually are, but who you think you are. And this belief is powerful because it acts as a filter. It determines what feels natural, what feels uncomfortable, and what feels necessary. If your self-image is rooted in scarcity, you will make decisions that reinforce that scarcity. If it is rooted in insecurity, you will seek ways to compensate for it. And if it is rooted in comparison, you will constantly adjust your behavior to keep up with others. But self-image is not static. It is influenced by exposure. Every time you see someone living a certain way, achieving a certain level, presenting a certain lifestyle, it adds a new reference point to your mind. And over time, Those reference points begin to reshape your expectations. What once felt like enough no longer does. What once felt like success now feels average. And what once felt out of reach now feels necessary. This is the second layer. Expectation inflation. It happens quietly, gradually, almost imperceptibly, but its impact is profound. Because as your expectations rise, your sense of satisfaction decreases. You need more to feel the same. More validation, more alignment, more proof that you are moving forward. And spending becomes the fastest way to simulate that progress. But simulation is not the same as transformation. And this is where the third layer comes in: emotional substitution. Instead of addressing the underlying discomfort, the feeling of being behind, of not being enough, of not measuring up, you substitute it with action. You convert emotion into transaction. You replace internal work with external movement. And for a moment, it works. The feeling shifts, the tension fades. You feel in control again, but the cause remains unchanged, unexamined, waiting. And so the next time the feeling appears, and it will, you repeat the process. Not because you want to, but because it has become familiar, predictable, almost automatic. And the more automatic it becomes, the less aware you are of it, until eventually, it feels like part of who you are. This is the trap. Not that you spend money, but that you no longer see why. You believe your actions are rational, that they are based on needs, on preferences, on reasonable justifications, and on the surface, they are. But beneath that surface, there is a different set of drivers at work. Drivers that operate without your permission. Drivers that shape your behavior in ways you don't consciously choose. And one of the most powerful of these drivers is ego. Not in the sense of arrogance, but in the sense of self-protection. Your ego is constantly trying to maintain a consistent image of who you are. It resists anything that challenges that image. It avoids situations that expose gaps or weaknesses. And when it feels threatened, it looks for ways to restore balance, to protect the narrative, to maintain the illusion of stability. Spending becomes one of those tools, because it allows you to reinforce your identity without confronting it. If you feel behind, you can spend to appear ahead. If you feel uncertain, you can spend to appear confident. If you feel disconnected, you can spend to appear aligned. And because these changes are visible both to yourself and to others, they create a temporary sense of validation. But validation is not the same as truth. And over time, the difference becomes harder to ignore. You begin to notice inconsistencies, small at first, then more obvious. The life you present does not fully match the life you live. The image you project does not fully match the way you feel. And that creates a subtle internal friction, a sense that something is off. Even if you can't fully articulate what it is, that friction is important because it is the signal that your actions and your identity are no longer aligned, that you are maintaining something rather than building something, that you are responding to pressure rather than acting with clarity. And if you ignore that signal, it does not disappear. It intensifies. It spreads into other areas of your life, into your decisions, your relationships, your sense of direction, and eventually, it reaches your finances, not as a sudden collapse, but as a gradual erosion, a slow drift away from stability, a widening gap between income and net worth, a growing dependence on external inputs to maintain internal balance. And by the time it becomes visible, the pattern has already been in place for years. This is why so many people feel like they are working hard but not moving forward, because their effort is real but it is misaligned, directed toward maintaining an identity rather than evolving it, focused on appearance rather than substance. And as long as that focus remains unchanged, the outcome will remain the same. You cannot out-earn an identity that works against you. You cannot out-budget a belief system that pulls you back. And you cannot out-discipline a pattern you do not understand. This is not a financial issue. It is a psychological one. And until you are willing to see it that way, you will continue to look for solutions in the wrong place. You will continue to adjust the surface while the structure beneath it remains untouched. You will continue to feel like you are trying without understanding why it never seems to be enough. But once you see it clearly, once you recognize the pattern for what it is, something shifts. Not immediately, not dramatically, but noticeably, you begin to pause. Not because you are forcing yourself to, but because the automatic response no longer feels invisible. You start to question, not just the purchase, but the reason behind it, the feeling driving it, the identity attached to it. And in that space between impulse and action, you gain something most people never do: awareness. And awareness changes everything. Because once you are aware, the pattern loses some of its power. It becomes visible, predictable, interruptible. You begin to see the triggers before they fully take hold, the emotions before they convert into action, the gap before you try to close it with something external. And that is where real change begins. Not with restriction, not with discipline, but with understanding. Understanding that your financial behavior is not random. Understanding that your spending is not about money. Understanding that every decision you make is connected to a deeper narrative. Most people believe that once they understand the problem, change will follow. That awareness alone is enough to shift behavior. But if that were true, no one would struggle with money twice. No one would repeat the same patterns after recognizing them. No one would say, "I know what I should do. I just don't do it." And yet, that is exactly where most people remain trapped between understanding and action. Clarity and consistency. Intention and reality. Because knowing is not the same as changing. And this is where the deeper resistance begins. You can see the pattern. You can recognize the emotional triggers. You can even predict your own behavior before it happens. But when the moment arrives, the exact moment when the decision needs to be made, something else takes over. Something quieter, but stronger. Something that does not respond to logic, does not negotiate with reason, and does not care how much you understand. That force is identity, and identity does not change because you want it to. It changes when it is redefined. Until then, it defends itself. This is why so many attempts at financial control fail, not because they are wrong, but because they are incomplete. They operate at the level of behavior, while the real resistance exists at the level of identity. And when those two are misaligned, identity always wins. You tell yourself you will stop unnecessary spending, but your identity is still tied to being someone who keeps up, someone who deserves more, someone who should be further ahead. So when the moment comes, when you feel the discomfort, the pressure, the subtle urge to correct that internal gap, your behavior shifts to protect that identity. Not because you lack discipline, but because you are being consistent with who you believe you are. This is the part most people misunderstand. They think inconsistency is a failure of willpower, but in reality, it is often a sign of consistency at a deeper level. You are not inconsistent. You are consistently acting in alignment with an identity that has never been questioned. And until that identity changes, your behavior will continue to return to it, no matter how many systems you build, no matter how many plans you create, no matter how motivated you feel in the beginning, because motivation fades, but identity persists. This is why discipline alone cannot solve the problem. Discipline is temporary. It requires energy. It depends on focus. It weakens under stress. And most importantly, it operates against resistance. It is an effort to override your natural tendencies. And while that can work in short bursts, it is not sustainable when the underlying identity remains the same. You can force yourself to act differently for a week, maybe even a month, but eventually you return, not because you failed, but because you reverted. You reverted to what feels familiar, to what feels natural, to what feels like you. And that is not a coincidence. It is a pattern, one that repeats itself across every area of life, not just money. This is why someone can lose weight and gain it back. Why someone can build savings and then slowly drain them. Why someone can make progress and then quietly undo it. Because progress built on behavior without identity change is fragile. It does not hold. And when pressure increases, when stress appears, when uncertainty rises, when emotional discomfort returns, your behavior shifts back to restore what feels stable. Not financially stable, But psychologically stable, this is the second layer of resistance. Not just identity, but emotional regulation. Most financial decisions are not made in neutral states. They are made in moments of tension. Moments when something feels off, when something feels lacking, when something feels uncertain. And in those moments, your priority is not long-term stability. It is immediate relief. You want to feel better. You want to reduce the discomfort. You want to restore a sense of control, and spending becomes the fastest way to do that. It is not logical, but it is effective, at least in the short term, because it creates a shift, a change in state, a temporary alignment between how you feel and how you want to feel. And that shift reinforces the behavior. It teaches your brain that spending is not just an action, but a solution, a way to regulate, a way to cope, a way to manage internal pressure. And once that association is formed, it becomes automatic. You no longer think about it as a choice. You experience it as a response, a reflex, something that happens before you fully realize it is happening. And this is where willpower breaks down. Because you are not just fighting a habit, you are interrupting a coping mechanism. And coping mechanisms are deeply rooted. They are built over time, reinforced through repetition, connected to emotion, and protected by identity. So when you try to stop them, you are not just removing a behavior, you are removing a source of relief. And unless you replace it with something else, something equally effective, you will return to it. Again and again. This is why so many financial systems fail. Not because they are poorly designed, but because they ignore the emotional function of spending. They treat money as numbers. But money, for most people, is not just numbers. It is meaning. It is validation. It is control. It is comfort. And when you remove spending without addressing what it provides, you create a vacuum, a gap. And that gap will be filled, if not with awareness, then with repetition. This is the third layer of resistance. Substitution. When you try to change your behavior without changing your identity or your emotional patterns, you don't eliminate the behavior. You redirect it, sometimes into smaller purchases, sometimes into different categories, sometimes into other areas of life. But the underlying pattern remains because the need remains. And until that need is addressed directly, the behavior will continue, just in different forms. This is why some people stop overspending, but become obsessive about saving. Why some people avoid material purchases, but chase status in other ways. Why some people reduce visible consumption, but increase hidden forms of compensation. Because the identity is still active, the need to feel enough, the need to feel aligned, the need to close the gap. It just finds new expressions. And this is where the illusion of control becomes dangerous. Because you believe you have changed. You believe you have improved. But in reality, the pattern has only shifted, become less visible, more subtle, but no less powerful. And over time, it resurfaces. Because unresolved patterns do not disappear. They adapt, they evolve, they wait, until the right conditions bring them back. And when they do, it feels like failure, like regression, like you lost progress. But in truth, the progress was never anchored, because it was built on behavior, not identity. This is why sustainable change requires something deeper. Not more control, not more restriction, but more alignment. Alignment between who you are and how you act. Between what you value and what you do. Between your internal narrative and your external decisions. And that alignment does not come from forcing yourself to behave differently. It comes from redefining the story you live by. The story about who you are, what you deserve, what success looks like, what progress means. Because as long as that story remains unchanged, your behavior will continue to reflect it, no matter how hard you try to override it. You will spend when the story tells you that you need to prove something. You will react when the story tells you that you are behind. You will compensate when the story tells you that you are not enough. And all of that will feel justified, because it aligns with your identity, even if it conflicts with your goals. This is the contradiction most people live with. A gap between what they want and how they act, between intention and outcome, between awareness and change. And that gap is not closed by effort. It is closed by identity shift, a shift that does not happen overnight. That does not come from a single decision, but from a gradual, deliberate process of questioning what you believe and choosing something different, not just once, but consistently, until the new identity begins to feel natural, until the new behavior no longer requires effort, until the alignment becomes automatic. And when that happens, something changes, not just in your finances, but in your experience of control, of clarity, of direction, because you are no longer reacting. You are no longer compensating. You are no longer trying to prove something. You are acting from a place of stability, of self-definition, of quiet certainty about who you are. And when that certainty exists, the need to spend to feel aligned disappears. Not because you are forcing yourself to stop, but because the reason to continue is no longer there. That is the difference. And that is why most people never get there. Because they focus on stopping behavior instead of understanding it. Because they try to control actions instead of redefining identity. Because they fight symptoms instead of addressing the source. And as long as they do that, they remain in this is what financial strength actually looks like. Not wealth that is displayed, but wealth that is sustained. Not success that is performed, but success that is lived. And the difference between the two is subtle but profound, because the person who has built their identity around external validation will always need more proof, more reinforcement, more spending to maintain the image. And no amount will ever feel like enough because the identity itself is unstable. But the person who has redefined their identity internally does not need that reinforcement. They do not need to spend to feel aligned. They do not need to prove anything because their sense of self is not tied to what they own. And that is where freedom begins. Not when you reach a certain number, not when you achieve a certain level, but when you are no longer controlled by the need to appear as someone you are not. That is the moment your financial life changes. Because from that point forward, your decisions are no longer driven by pressure. They are driven by clarity, by intention, by a quiet understanding of what matters and what does not. You no longer chase the feeling of being enough. You begin to live as someone who already is. And that shift removes the urgency, the impulse, the need to correct yourself through spending, because there is nothing left to prove. This is the final transformation. Not a technique, not a system, but a realization that the moment you stop using money to define your worth is the moment your money begins to work for you. Not as a tool for validation, but as a tool for building something real, something stable, something aligned. And that is the difference between those who appear wealthy and those who actually are. One is maintained through constant action. The other is sustained through quiet identity. And once you understand that, you begin to move differently, think differently, decide differently, not because you have to, but because you have.